They expected you to lose it. They were counting on your rage, your confusion, your emotional spiral. They needed it, because when you react, they feel relevant. But when you didn't, when you stayed calm, it shook them to their core. And now they're lost, confused, threatened, because your calm destroyed their control. What you're about to hear could change your life. I'm building the most powerful guide for men ever created, the Stoic Relationship Blueprint. If you've ever been lied to, manipulated, guilt-tripped, or left wondering why being a good man wasn't enough, this will be your antidote. If what I say resonates with you, drop a comment. I choose Stoic power. Number 1. They hate that you don't react. They hate that you don't react, not because they want peace, but because their influence evaporates the moment you stop giving them access to your emotional pulse. And what drives them insane is not your anger or sadness, but your restraint. Because in the past, they could predict your reactions like reading lines from a book. You'd flare up, argue, explain yourself, overextend, over-apologize, and fall right into the patterns they choreographed. But now you don't just step back, you detach, and they can't handle the absence of noise, not because it's peaceful, but because they no longer control the tempo, the rhythm, the tone of your life. And the truth is, people like this never loved you for who you were. They were addicted to what they could extract from your vulnerability. They fed on your reactions like oxygen, and when that supply is cut off, they don't reflect, they retaliate. But what can they do when there's nothing left to provoke, nothing left to ignite, nothing to argue with, and nothing to twist? You're gone in ways that are deeper than physical departure. Your heart no longer seeks their validation. Your mind no longer entertains their chaos. Your soul no longer waits for them to change. And that terrifies them, not because they've lost someone, but because they've lost control. And this is where most men fall back into old habits. They reach out when they feel guilt, when they feel a shift. They feel the energy shift and panic because they're used to running the show through manipulation. But when you stand unmoved, you reveal the weakest parts of their identity. You shine light on the game they play, and this infuriates them because now they're seen not for who they pretend to be, but for who they really are. People who feed off others to avoid facing themselves. And when you no longer react, they have to sit in the uncomfortable truth that they never had power, just permission. And you revoked that permission when you stopped showing up to be hurt, when you stopped explaining your worth, when you stopped repeating conversations with no outcome, when you stopped investing in relationships that were built on emotional exploitation, not mutual respect. And here's where it gets even more intense. Your lack of response triggers their identity crisis because they depended on your emotional availability to maintain the illusion of superiority. And now they're disoriented because they don't know how to control what they can't understand. And they don't understand calm. They don't understand grounded. They don't understand someone who's taken responsibility for their inner world and closed the gates to chaos. They don't understand emotional sovereignty. And that gap, the space between who you were and who you've become, exposes them to the reality they've avoided their entire life. That true power comes from self-control, not domination. And that's a lesson they're unwilling to learn. So instead of evolving, they label you as cold. They tell people you changed. They spin narratives that paint you as the villain, because it's easier to demonize your boundaries than admit they were never capable of meeting them. And yet here you are, not bitter, not broken, just better, just clearer, just unavailable for games that cost your peace. And if you've ever been in that place, you know the tension it creates when you enter a room and say nothing, and yet they feel everything, because the most painful realization for manipulators is discovering that you've healed in a way that makes them irrelevant. You've grown in ways they can't reach, and this isn't theoretical. This is what happens when a man chooses stillness over outrage, clarity over chaos, purpose over pandering, and that choice doesn't come overnight. It comes through disappointment, betrayal, abandonment, and a quiet voice inside that says, enough. Enough of proving, enough of explaining, enough of playing emotional chess with people who don't even care about the rules. And once you reach that place, you become untouchable. Not because you hide from life, but because you've mastered the art of showing up differently, with intention, with standards, with presence. And no matter how they try to bait you, guilt you, shame you back into the old version of yourself, they can't resurrect who you used to be, because that man no longer exists. And the hardest part of this evolution isn't leaving them behind. It's watching them spiral when they realize they've lost access, not to your body, not to your attention, but to your emotional generosity, your grace, your second chances, your tolerance for confusion disguised as love. And they hate it not because you hurt them, but because you won't let them hurt you anymore. And the freedom you now walk in is foreign to them. The way you hold your center, the way you move with quiet assurance, the way you don't respond to old triggers. They can't relate, and so they label, they attack, they project. But nothing sticks, because once you learn to stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you, you gain a peace that doesn't require approval. And in this world, especially now, men are taught that reacting is strength, that yelling, asserting, dominating is how you take control. But that's not power. It's insecurity masquerading as authority, and the real strength is in not letting anyone dictate how you feel. And when you choose that path, the world shifts around you. People reveal themselves in ways that would shock you. Allies become enemies, lovers become strangers, and what used to tempt you now repulses you, not because you're angry, but because you're awake. And once you're awake, you stop trading your emotional clarity for temporary company. You stop making excuses for people who were never committed to understanding your worth. You stop watering desserts and calling it growth. And from this place, you stop reacting, not out of spite, but because you've outgrown the conversations, the dynamics, the energy cycles that once drained you. And if that feels like you right now, if you've been the man who kept breaking your own boundaries to prove your loyalty, just know this. The moment you stop chasing people who cause confusion is the moment you start attracting people who match your clarity. And that shift begins with one decision: to no longer be reactive, to no longer let people rent space in your head who aren't invested in your peace, and to understand that real power is quiet, deliberate, intentional. And when you embrace that, not only will they hate that you don't react, but they'll fear the man you've become, because you now hold the one thing they never could: control over yourself. Number 2, they can't play the victim anymore. They can't play the victim anymore because once you stop reacting, you cut the script they've been rehearsing their entire lives. This game where they wrong you, push your buttons, twist your emotions, and then as soon as you react out of pain or confusion, they flip the roles and cry foul, claiming you were too emotional, too dramatic, too much. And for a long time, they got away with it because every time you exploded in defense of your character, your dignity, your right to be treated like a human being, they would zoom in on your tone, your volume, your timing, anything but the actual damage they caused, and they'd weaponize your reaction as evidence against your worth, your stability, your masculinity. And you probably believed them, didn't you? You probably walked away from arguments thinking you were the problem, carrying the shame of someone else's sabotage, questioning your own heart, your own values, your own motives. And that was always the goal: to make you forget what they did by making you regret how you responded. But the moment you stopped defending yourself, the entire system they built began to collapse, because they have no substance, just tactics. And those tactics require engagement. They rely on your impulse to prove you're not what they accuse you of, But what if you just didn't engage? What if you didn't clarify your intentions, didn't fight the accusation, didn't chase to clean up the mess they made in your name? That's when the game ends, not because they surrendered, but because they were never playing fair to begin with. And now they're exposed, not in public, but in the worst place possible, in their own conscience, because there's no noise to distract from what they did, no reactive outburst to shift the narrative, and so they're left alone with the facts, the patterns, the history, the cold echo of what they created, and it eats at them, not because they feel genuine remorse, but because they can't spin the story anymore. They can't cast themselves as the wounded party when you won't play the antagonist. They can't draw sympathy from the people around them when your absence radiates peace, stability, and progress. And it's infuriating for them to watch you live without needing to correct the record, because their power wasn't in being right. It was in keeping you on the defensive, in having you chase the truth through a maze of gaslighting and guilt. And now they're furious, not because you hurt them, but because you stopped allowing them to hurt you without consequence. And that consequence isn't punishment, it's absence, it's access revoked. And when a man stops explaining his character and starts embodying it, there's nothing to argue, nothing to dispute, just results. And now they're stuck with the reality that they have to sit with their own behavior, with no one to argue with, no one to deflect to, no one to demonize, because they've run out of script. And this is the part they never expected. You becoming whole without them, you telling your story not through words, but through actions, through transformation, through the calm that follows alignment. And they don't know how to survive in a world where they don't get to manipulate perception, because that's what it always was, perception management. And now they're unraveling, not because they miss you, but because they miss the version of you who needed to prove himself. And without that, they're irrelevant, not by your decree, but by their design, because they gambled on your weakness and lost to your strength. And the moment you understood that your worth isn't determined by your ability to defend yourself, but by your ability to walk away from things that insult your integrity, they lost their audience, they lost their leverage, they lost the game they built around your uncertainty, and now you see it for what it is, an act, a performance that only works when the other person is invested in the illusion. But you're no longer that man. You've reclaimed your narrative, and the only thing they can play now is the past, while you move forward, writing a future they'll never be invited into. Number 3. They thought you needed them. They thought you needed them because they misread your loyalty for dependency, your patience for desperation, your consistency for lack of options. And the truth is, many of us have stayed in places too long, not because we didn't know we deserved more, but because we wanted to believe the other person would rise to the occasion. We saw potential, we saw history, we saw a future, and we thought maybe if we just love a little harder, hold on a little longer, fight a little more, maybe they'll finally see it too. And when they didn't, it broke us. Not because they left, but because we stayed through the disrespect, through the manipulation, through the passive aggression, through the guilt trips, through the disconnection. And they assumed our staying was weakness, that we had no identity outside the relationship, outside the title, outside their validation. And that was their first mistake. Believing that because we chose them, we needed them. But choosing someone out of love isn't the same as needing them out of fear. And when the time came that we chose ourselves, it wasn't because we stopped loving. It was because we started respecting. And that kind of shift is terrifying for people who build their value around being wanted, not being worthy. And what shocked them wasn't your exit. It was your clarity, your ability to move forward without bitterness, without seeking closure, without trying to make them understand. Because people who think they're your lifeline expect you to beg, expect you to plead, expect you to prove your value at the door on your way out. And when you don't, they crumble, because it confronts them with a truth they've never considered. They weren't needed, they were tolerated, and that tolerance was not a weakness. It was mercy, it was grace, it was the mature hope that they would evolve. And when they didn't, you withdrew not your affection, but your access. And suddenly, the foundation they thought they stood on collapsed beneath them, not because you took it away, but because it was never real to begin with. It was built on projection, on the fantasy that they were essential, and now that you've walked, they see it for what it is. An illusion broken by reality, a dream broken by discipline, and in that awakening, they experience something they've never prepared for. Irrelevance, because men who reclaim their value don't look back. And the man you've become now is someone they can't recognize, can't predict, can't reach, because your strength is no longer tied to how much you can carry in the name of love, but how deeply you can honor your peace in the face of familiarity. And that power doesn't look like arrogance. It looks like quiet self-respect, like waking up with energy they no longer drain, like building a life they're not centered in, like laughing again and meaning it, sleeping again and dreaming, healing in places they used to call home. And that's the shock. They thought they were irreplaceable, but the only thing you lost was the illusion that you needed them to be whole. And now that you're whole without them, they're left to sit with a version of you that no longer worships the idea of them, and the hardest thing they'll ever have to do is watch you thrive in a life they thought you couldn't build alone. And yet, here you are, free, focused, evolving, and they don't even know the man they helped create, because you didn't just walk away, you walked into your future and the path ahead. It's yours alone. Number 4. They expected drama, not discipline. They expected chaos when you found out the truth, when you finally realized the lies, when you saw the patterns, because that's what they were used to, not just from you, but from everyone they've ever manipulated. They expected shouting, begging, endless texting, threats of leaving followed by desperate returns, long drawn-out emotional fights where nothing gets resolved, but everything gets tangled deeper, because that's the environment they thrive in, one of instability, of highs and lows, of constant escalation. And when you didn't give them that, when you didn't raise your voice, didn't seek revenge, didn't chase explanations, it shook them more than any words ever could. Because discipline, real discipline, is quiet, it's controlled, it's a decision repeated over and over again, no matter how much you want to lash out. And they weren't prepared for a man who could see the fire and choose not to burn with it, who could be betrayed and still walk out without slamming the door, who could be hurt but not lose his head, because drama was their only language. And when you refused to speak it, they were left with nothing but their own noise, and that noise got louder without your participation, because your discipline forced them to face their own disorder, and that's not something most people are capable of doing. So instead, they projected, they accused, they blamed you for being cold, detached, robotic even, not realizing that you weren't void of emotion, you were full of self-control, and that's what terrified them. Because someone who's in control of themselves is out of their control, and someone who won't argue back can't be baited, can't be manipulated, can't be looped into another cycle of dysfunction. And if you've ever lived through that shift, where you go from reacting emotionally to responding logically, from proving your worth to walking away from disrespect, you know the internal war it takes to win that way, because it's not about suppressing what you feel, it's about deciding who deserves access to what you feel, and not everyone does. Not everyone has earned the right to your attention, your energy, your explanations, and once you understand that, you become unshakable, not because you feel nothing, but because you finally realize that not everything deserves a reaction, and that understanding doesn't make you weak or passive. It makes you powerful in a way that people who depend on chaos will never comprehend, because their power has always come from provoking, not persuading, from emotional warfare, not emotional intelligence. And now they're up against something they've never had to face. A man who doesn't need the last word to have the final say. A man who doesn't argue his worth, who doesn't need to be loud to be heard, who doesn't need to prove a point to make it. And when you become that man, disciplined, grounded, inwardly solid, you change the room just by being in it. And the same people who once ran circles around your boundaries now stand frozen, because the playbook they've used their whole lives doesn't work anymore, and they don't know how to exist outside of drama. They don't know how to engage without triggering, without poking, without escalating. And when they realize that none of those tools can penetrate your peace, they either spiral or disappear, not because you pushed them out, but because your discipline illuminated how unstable they were to begin with, and now you're living in a space they can't reach. Not because you built walls, but because you built standards. And those standards don't require explanation or validation. They just are. And that's what discipline gives you. Not just peace, but a life where only the aligned can survive, and everyone else self-selects out. And that may sound harsh, but in a world where your peace is preyed on by people who mistake kindness for weakness, your discipline is your protection. And if you've ever felt like discipline was too slow, too subtle, not satisfying enough, just remember, it's not about looking strong. It's about becoming strong in ways no one can take from you. Number 5, they never thought you'd walk away. They never thought you'd actually leave. Not you, not the man who stayed through every argument, who forgave things that weren't even apologized for, who showed up again and again hoping that the love he gave would one day be returned in full, who made excuses for behavior that drained him, who held on when it hurt because he believed that maybe, just maybe, the history meant more than the hurt, and they counted on that version of you. They built their sense of safety around the idea that you'd always be there, no matter what they did. And so they pushed, they tested, they crossed lines just to see how far they could go. They withdrew affection to watch you chase. They gave you inconsistency to see if you'd still invest. They made you prove your love through endurance, not knowing that every time you stayed, a little piece of your respect for them died. And what they didn't understand was that love has a limit. Not because the heart stops feeling, but because the soul gets tired of waiting, tired of trying to save someone who doesn't want to be saved, tired of lowering standards to keep someone who only sees value when they fear losing it. And the day you finally walked wasn't the day you stopped caring. It was the day you finally accepted that they never cared the way you needed them to, and that realization didn't come easy. It came after sleepless nights and silent drives, after analyzing every conversation, every red flag you ignored, every moment you begged for clarity, for honesty, for respect. And when it hit you, it didn't make you angry. It made you done. And there's a difference, because anger still wants something, still hopes for change, still believes there's a future worth fighting for, but being done, that's a quiet funeral, not for love, but for illusion. For the version of you that tolerated being treated like a backup plan in a story where you were supposed to be the foundation. And when you walked, they didn't believe it at first. Because people who use emotional inconsistency as control are shocked when it stops working. They're so used to their absence creating urgency that when your absence created indifference, they didn't know how to cope, and suddenly the tables turned. Not because you reversed roles, but because you reclaimed your worth. And the same man who once explained himself in paragraphs now answers with presence or not at all. The same man who once held on through storms now walks away at the first sign of weather that doesn't match his energy. Not because he's cold, but because he's grown. And that growth isn't loud. It doesn't need validation. It doesn't need to be explained. It just shows in how you move now, how you guard your peace, how you choose relationships that don't require translation or tension or 10 chances. And the people who once believed they had time are left behind, not because you wanted to punish them, but because they misused every moment they were given. And now you're not angry, You're just unavailable for anything less than mutual energy, mutual effort, mutual growth. And if you're the man on the edge, still hoping they'll change, still thinking maybe just one more chance, let this be the reminder. The man you are becoming can't afford to keep compromising for the comfort of someone committed to misunderstanding him. The man you are becoming deserves a life where love isn't earned through pain, but honored through presence, where walking away isn't failure but freedom, and when they finally realize what they lost, when they see the new version of you rising, thriving, creating, building, they'll reach out, not because they've changed, but because they now see what they never saw before, that your absence isn't punishment, it's prophecy fulfilled, because the day you walked away was the day you finally walked into everything you were meant to become. Number 6. They can't handle your emotional distance. They can't handle your emotional distance not because they want closeness, but because the emotional access they once exploited is now closed, and what frustrates them the most is not your absence, but your unavailability. They miss your vulnerability, not out of love, but because it was the entry point for their control, for their manipulations, for their ability to sway your energy at will. And now that you've withdrawn that energy, now that you no longer respond with urgency to their chaos or validation to their inconsistencies, they are forced to sit in the discomfort of their own irrelevance, because for so long they believed your presence was automatic, your loyalty unconditional, your attention a given. But what they failed to see was that your heart came with boundaries, even if you didn't enforce them at first. And when you finally did, it rewrote every rule they had been playing by, and that shift is something most people never anticipate, because they see your kindness and assume it comes from weakness, your patience and assume it's permanent, your consistency and assume it's blindness. But emotional distance is not passive aggression, it's protection. It's you choosing not to give the most sacred parts of yourself to someone who treats them like leverage. And if you've ever had to create space from someone you once couldn't imagine living without, you know that pain doesn't disappear. It transforms, it becomes resolve, it becomes wisdom, it becomes the lesson you didn't want but needed. And with that wisdom comes a recalibration of who gets access to your thoughts, your time, your truths. And suddenly, the same person who could once get you flustered with a word or a glance now gets nothing, not because you hate them, but because they lost the right to influence your emotions. And that loss is unbearable to them, not because they love you, but because it dismantles the story they told themselves, that they were special, irreplaceable, essential. And what's worse for them is that they still try the old tricks, the random check-ins, the subtle provocations, the guilt-laced questions like, "Why are you so distant?" and "What happened to us?" As if they weren't the ones who poisoned the connection in the first place. And when they don't get the rise they expect, they spiral, because emotional distance isn't just a boundary, it's a mirror. It reflects their impact on you. It shows them how deeply they've failed to be the kind of person you could stay emotionally present with, and they can't unsee that, can't escape it, and that's when the blame starts. When the accusations of you being cold or emotionless start pouring in, not because you've changed for the worse, but because you've changed in a way they can't manipulate. And what makes this change so powerful is that it isn't reactive, it's intentional, it's based on growth, on reflection, on the realization that not everyone is equipped to handle your openness, that not every relationship deserves emotional transparency, and that your peace is too expensive to trade for a connection that costs you clarity. And yes, they'll say you're different now, and they're right. But not in the way they think, because you've matured, you've outgrown the version of yourself that needed to be understood by people who refused to listen, who used your openness as ammunition, who took your transparency as a target instead of a gift. And now they stand at a distance, watching you reclaim every piece of yourself you once gave away freely, wondering how you became so emotionally untouchable. And the truth is, you didn't harden. You healed. You stopped explaining. You stopped apologizing for your needs. You stopped engaging with people who confuse connection with control. And if you're in that phase now, where you feel guilty for creating space, where people are trying to shame you back into emotional submission, remind yourself that your inner world is yours, that protecting it isn't selfish, it's sacred, and emotional distance isn't abandonment, it's clarity. It's choosing what aligns with your values and letting go of what only survives through guilt, confusion, and fear. And in doing so, you redefine love, not as sacrifice, but as shared responsibility. And when you embody that standard, you don't lose relationships, you lose illusions. And those illusions had to break so the truth could finally breathe. Number 7. They feel exposed by your evolution. They feel exposed by your evolution because nothing reveals someone's true intentions more than watching you become the person they never believed you could be, or worse, never wanted you to be. Because your growth challenges their narrative, your strength undermines their superiority, your peace invalidates their chaos, and the very things they once mocked, dismissed, or tried to suppress in you are now the foundation of your transformation, and it terrifies them, not because they fear you, but because they fear being seen through. They fear the contrast between who they are and who you've become. And when you level up emotionally, mentally, spiritually, it puts a spotlight on their stagnation, their immaturity, their refusal to take accountability, and that reflection is unbearable for people who survive by pretending they're ahead, when in reality they've been running in circles. And the deeper your evolution goes, the more evident it becomes that they were never part of your growth. They were the obstacle you had to outgrow, the pain that pushed you toward purpose, the confusion that forced clarity, and that realization is one they can't avoid anymore because they see you now, sharper, clearer, more grounded, more focused, and it eats at them because it exposes the gap, the chasm between who you used to be when you tolerated their nonsense and who you are now that you've reclaimed your power. And what hurts them isn't your success. It's the fact that they no longer have access to it, no longer get to be seen next to it, and they can't take credit for it, can't hijack the narrative and spin it like they helped you become who you are. Because the truth is, your glow came after the detachment, your clarity came after the chaos, your discipline came after the disrespect, and they weren't part of that process. They were the reason for it. And now you walk differently, speak differently, move differently, not out of spite, but out of refinement. And the people who once treated you like an option are now watching you become a standard. And that transformation triggers them deeply, because they realize they miscalculated. They undervalued you. They thought you were stuck. And now they're stuck watching the elevation they once delayed. And that exposure is brutal, not because you're flaunting it, but because your very existence in this new version calls them out without saying a word. Your presence holds them accountable just by being, and they try to rewrite history, to downplay your growth, to act like it's not real or not sustainable, because admitting your evolution means admitting their negligence, their pettiness, their ego-driven decisions, and that's too heavy a truth to carry for someone who still refuses to own their part. So instead they distance, they project, they sabotage new relationships by telling old stories that no longer reflect who you are, and yet none of it sticks, because the man you are now doesn't need defense. Your growth is your defense, your evolution is your proof, and if you're walking this road now, where your changes are met with criticism, where your boundaries are misunderstood, where your peace makes others uncomfortable, keep going, because that discomfort isn't your problem, it's their mirror, and not everyone can handle what they see when you stop shrinking to make them comfortable. And evolution isn't meant to be palatable for the people you've outgrown. It's meant to align you with those who speak your new language, who value your new rhythm, who meet you where you are, not where you used to be. And that's the beauty of this journey. You don't need to explain your transformation to anyone who wasn't willing to walk it with you, and the people who truly see you now will never feel exposed by your evolution. They'll be inspired by it, and they'll rise with you. You've heard every word because somewhere deep inside, it felt like your story. Like the pieces of you that were never protected. Like the moments you gave everything and got torn apart for it. And if you've ever felt unseen, unheard, unappreciated, or emotionally used, just know you're not broken, you're evolving. The world doesn't give men space to speak this truth. You're expected to carry it all, to be strong with no cracks, to endure pain in silence while being blamed for being distant, cold, or emotionally unavailable. You've been shamed for wanting love, mocked for having standards, laughed at when you drew lines in the sand. And even then, you stayed solid. But this time, it's your turn. That's why I've been building something powerful behind the scenes, a complete and unfiltered system that goes deeper than anything you've ever read or heard. It's the Stoic relationship blueprint, and it's dropping very soon. This is more than a guide. It's your armor, your roadmap, your foundation. For the men tired of being manipulated. For the men done giving second, third, fourth chances to people who never deserved the first. For the men who want to rebuild their identity, protect their energy, and walk into every room as the most grounded, untouchable version of themselves. This blueprint is your answer. When it's out, you're not going to want to wait. You're going to need it. Comment blueprint below if you're ready to transform your life and relationships from the inside out, permanently. And if this video spoke to you, like it, share it, and subscribe. Not just for yourself, but for the men out there who've never been told that they deserve more, who've never been shown the tools to truly live.